Obviously, February 14th was a tragic day in Broward County. And with every single one of these mass shooting events, whether it be Aurora, Colorado, Washington, D.C., San Bernardino, California, the Navy Yard up in Washington, I always said, every interview I ever did, if it can happen there, it can happen anywhere. If it can happen there in Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut, it can happen in Broward County. We have to be ready. We have to prepare. We have to train. We have to have policies in place. They're going to help us. And unfortunately, that premonition on February 14th sadly came true because it happened to us right here in Broward County. I can tell you during my time as sheriff, every time there was one of those incidents, we tried to learn from them. We sent detectives to the scene, to the agency, to Connecticut, to Aurora, Colorado. We got them on the phone. What did they learn? The chief of Aurora, Colorado, that was the Batman movie, where the shooting in the movie theater. Well, Dan Oates, was the chief there. He's now the chief in Miami Beach. And we had reached out to him. What can we learn from these incidents? And every time there was one, I made it a point. We're going to send folks there. We're going to get them on the phone. We're going to learn what they learned so that we could put it in place in Broward County to try to avert that or help us should we have one of those incidents. And I'll give you some examples. The biggest thing we learned from Aurora, Colorado was when the call went out, everybody from surrounding areas, all the law enforcement, showed up at that movie theater to the point where the roads were so clogged with police cars, they could not get ambulances in to rescue the victims. So they had to transport victims in the back seats of patrol cars, not where you want to transport a victim of a shooting to a hospital. You want them to have the best care possible in an ambulance with a paramedic. Well, that did not happen. And they learned a lesson, and that's one thing we took. When you respond to these things, you have to make sure that you have points of ingress and egress, so you don't happen that. In Atlanta, there was a courthouse shooting where a suspect got a hold of a deputy's gun and started shooting people in the courthouse. The judge in the courtroom got on the phone and said, have an active shooter in room 614 in the courthouse. Everybody ran to courtroom 614. There was nobody there. What we learned from that incident, that judge was in that courtroom temporarily. He was not in 614, his courtroom. He was in courtroom 409. But instant kicked in. He said, I'm in room 614, and there was a delayed response. So, when I came back from that, actually, we had one of their people came down, Miami-Dade PD had sent people to Atlanta. We met with them. The one thing they did, you know what they did? Simple. And this is what I did in the old courthouse. Put the courtroom number, not just on the outside of the courtroom, put it on the inside, above the door. So automatically something happened, you know what courtroom you're in. I mean, that sounds pretty simple, right? But nobody ever did that. One of the things we learned from Newtown in Connecticut at Sandy Hook, they couldn't lock their classroom doors. The teachers could not lock the doors. There was no locking mechanism. The classrooms had glass side lights on the side of the classroom door. And so we looked at that and said, you know what? We have to recommend to the school board that we need to retrofit these schools with locking mechanisms so if it happens, the teacher can lock the door. Now, we had a lot better success with the private schools, and the charter schools in Broward than we did with the public schools. Obviously, that's a cost item, but something as simple as that. And we learned that from talking to the people who experienced it. And we were able to learn from every one of these tragedies. And that's what I always looked at. What can we learn from these tragedies? Well, everybody talks about, okay, at Stoneham and Douglas. Do you go in? Do you not go in? I can tell you the old protocol was the old protocol, and people say it was pre-Columbine, post-Columbine. I think it was after Columbine. But the old protocol was you secure the perimeter and you wait for the SWAT team. Because SWAT had the training, they had the equipment, they had the tactics necessary to be able to deal with an active shooter. But when seconds count, you have to react. These shooter incidents, active shooter incidents, they're over in 5 minutes. A SWAT team is going to be a half an hour. So we decided, and this is nationally, not just in Broward, we decided on a national protocol to say we are going to go in. We have to confront the shooter as soon as possible. Because again, they're over in 5 minutes. I can tell you, we studied every one of these shooting incidents nationwide. There's 4 ways that these things end. 4 ways. You can study them all. There's only 4 ways. 1, the police kill the shooter. 2, the shooter flees. The shooter surrenders, or the shooter commits suicide. Only 4. And every one of those 4 scenarios about how you end one of these things, it's all dependent on confronting the shooter as soon as possible. It's not about waiting a half an hour. It's not about setting up a perimeter and waiting for SWAT. It's going in immediately and confronting the shooter. Again, only 4, and every one of them involves confronting that shooter immediately. Okay, so that new protocol was, on the active shooter, we are going to go in, first guy on the scene makes an assessment, and you're going in. Now we train optimally. It's nice to have 4 officers, because there's tactics that we built in that you can have 4 officers is optimal. But if you get there and you're the only one, and the threat is still going on, and put it this way, if you hear gunshots, threat's still going on. And when seconds count, you have to be in there, because every one of those gunshots is a potential victim. And so if you don't have 4, we've made it clear to people, you go in. If you're by yourself, you go in. Every police academy that I spoke at, every new set of deputies that I swore in, one of the things I always left them with was this: there is going to come a time, there is going to come a day where you're going to have to collect your paycheck. February 14th was one of those days. It was time to collect your paycheck. And you can go 22 years, you can go 20 years, you can go 25 years, you can go 30 years, and you may never see one of those days. But when that day comes, you better be ready, because that's what you pay us to do. It's time to collect that paycheck. You pay us to do that. That paycheck comes from you, and there is an obligation. And so to say, well, you know, I gave him a badge, I gave him a gun, I gave him the training, but that's all I can do? I'm sorry, that doesn't fly. That does not fly. Okay? This is about making sure that everybody knows what they need to do. It comes time to collect that paycheck. And again, February 14th was one of those days. And I'm sad that this happened at an agency that I served at for 35 years. I was the first sheriff that ever came up through the ranks. I was the most proud of that, of anything I accomplished in 35 years. That was the one thing I was most proud of. That I was able to start in the jail in 1977 and work my way up through the ranks. And you have to convey to everybody that, you know, comes a time you have to collect your paycheck. And I left every group of deputies I swore in with that message. And you can't say I'm not responsible. Because I could tell you, you'll be in for a rude awakening when that first lawsuit is filed. Because guess what? Your name is going to be on the top of that lawsuit. I was sued by an inmate who didn't like the food in the jail.
Oh, well.
I didn't buy the food. I didn't cook the food. I didn't serve the food. But I got sued. Because when you're the sheriff, you're responsible. You're responsible for everything that happens in that organization. Leadership 101, Chapter 1, Paragraph 1. The sheriff is responsible. And you have an obligation to make sure everybody under you knows what they need to do. And again, so that active shooter protocol is no mystery. I mean, nationally, we train and train and train. Why there was a breakdown, I mean, I'm looking forward to seeing the FDLE report when it comes out to see, because I want to know. Because that's not the agency that I left. I was pretty comfortable when I left that people knew what they had to do. You never know until they're tested, but on February 14th they were tested. Now, when I was elected sheriff in 2008, somebody took me aside and said to me, you know what, you're the sheriff. You're not the Republican sheriff. You're not the Democrat sheriff. You're just the sheriff. And you're the sheriff of everybody. Nick Navarro was famous for saying that, if you ever heard him say that. I'm sheriff of all the peoples.
That's right.
And he lived by that. He really did. And he was a mentor for me, and he really lived by that. Because he didn't look at that. I'm not the Republican sheriff. I'm not the Democrat sheriff. You know, one of the things I said when I first got elected, shortly thereafter, when you call 911, you do not hear press 1 if you're a Republican, press 2 if you're a Democrat. And I always said, people are not, or victims are not Republicans or Democrats, they're people. Right. And you don't do the job any different. But unfortunately, what I see right now is it's all politics all the time. And it can't be that. It cannot be that. It is about leadership. But when politics starts to get in the way of leadership, that's a recipe for disaster. And one of the things I proposed, and people thought I was crazy for doing it, why is it Republican or Democrat? Why shouldn't it be nonpartisan? 7 counties in Florida have made it nonpartisan. And you know, I got great support from the Republican Party in Broward. Did. Even though I was Republican, everybody thought that made sense. In Palm Beach County, when it was put on the ballot, it passed like 78% of the people voted for it. Well, what does that say? They understand that. The average person understands that. So, you know, maybe it's a time out of this that will surface again. And that would be one of the things that I would like to see. Because I can tell you, I never looked at it, you know, there's a Republican way to do this or a Democrat way to do this. There's one way to do it, and it didn't matter to me about any kind of party label. And you know, when you see what's going on, it saddens me, because that was an agency I gave 35 years, almost 36 years of my life to that agency. It was the only job I ever had, real job other than the military. To see the constant back and forth about that agency, it hurts me, it hurts those people in the back that are here with me. But I'm saddened that we couldn't do something for those 17 people. The 3 teachers that were there, they were really heroes. When you read about what they did, you know, as human shields, and the 3 or 4 students, those ROTC students that held our door closed, I can imagine what they were going through. And that's something that none of our kids should ever have to go through that, really. And, hopefully there'll be some takeaways from this. But I can tell you, you have to be willing to accept responsibility. Can't say it's not my responsibility, because we don't elect the sheriff to say it's not my responsibility. We elect the sheriff to take responsibility and make sure that our kids are safe and our communities are safe. It just hurts me to see that. And hopefully that's gonna change. Make BSO great again? I don't know. It is a great organization. The men, women, there are 6,000 agencies, the third largest sheriff's office in the country. There's a lot of great men and women that work there. They're dedicated, but it takes leadership at the top to make sure they know what to do. They're not out there on their own. You gotta make sure they're not out there on their own, and they do know what to do, and you have to give them the support that they need to be successful. So Kevin, Jay, everyone else, thank you for inviting me. I do.
And we'll do a little bit of Q&A, and since I'll come back to you in a second, I'm going to ask the first one if I can.
Yes, sir.
I've been reading about,